The rain had turned the county road into a black mirror when Ellis Vaughn saw her. An elderly woman beside a stalled sedan on the shoulder, one thin hand lifted at the traffic that hissed past without slowing. Ellis had every reason to drive straight on. His garage was 2 weeks from closing under a debt he had no way to pay, and it had been more than a month since he had last sat down to dinner with his own son. But there was something in him older than his troubles, the plain habit of a decent man, the kind that would not let him leave a person standing alone in the cold. So he pulled over. He raised the hood and listened to the engine turn, and something in the sound was wrong before he could put a name to it. Then his flashlight caught it. A sensor wire cut clean through, one deliberate stroke of a blade, and beside it, a fuse that did not belong. Not age, not rust. It had been rigged to kill the engine without warning at speed, to tear the wheel out of an old woman's hands on a wet, dark curve, and leave a wreck the world would call an accident. Tonight, it had simply died early, at low speed. She had been lucky, and luck had never been part of the plan. He kept his face calm so he would not frighten her, and then he set to work in the downpour. It took more than an hour, bent over the engine with the rain running off his back, before the car finally turned over and held. She took out her wallet to thank him, and he closed her hand around the money and would not take a dollar of it. She studied him a long moment, the grease on his hands, the rain running off a coat too thin for the weather, the plain fact of a man who had stopped when no one else would. "Son," she said gently, "what is your name? And would you give an old woman a number where she can reach you?" There was a tenderness in the way she asked, as though he were someone worth remembering, and it reached a place in him that had gone cold a long time ago. He found himself smiling, the first real smile in longer than he could say, and gave her his name and the garage's number, watching her press them into her phone with slow, careful fingers. Then she took his rough hand in both of hers and held it. "God will always watch over a good man like you," she said. Then he watched her taillights dissolve into the rain. That night, the thing under that hood would not let him go. He had barely eaten. He lay in the dark, turning it over. Who cuts a wire like that? And who was it meant for? When his phone buzzed on the nightstand. The voice on the line was a stranger's, a woman's, and cold as a bank vault swinging shut. She gave her name, said she was the old woman's daughter, and thanked him for stopping. Under all that cold, he could hear one true thing. She meant it. Ellis was not a man of many words. He only told her it was nothing. And then, quietly, he said the part he could not swallow. "That car didn't break down on its own. Someone wanted your mother dead." The line went very still. And in that silence sat the only question that mattered now. Who? Who had reached under an old woman's hood and set her up to die on a dark road? And why a stranger's small kindness had just placed Ellis Vaughn squarely in their path. Subscribe and stay with him. This is a story worth seeing all the way to the end. Ellis Vaughn had not always been the quiet mechanic on the edge of Detroit. Once he had a name people trusted and a life that made sense. A diagnostics engineer with a steady salary, a small house with the lights always on, and a gift that set him apart. He could lay a hand on a running engine and feel a fault the way most people feel their own heartbeat, and read the whole story of a machine in the time it took to idle. He had a wife who laughed easily, Frances, and a young son, and for a while the ordinary happiness of that was the only thing he ever thought he would need. Then it was taken from him, cleanly and on purpose. A data leak scandal broke at the company where he worked, Halcyon Diagnostics, and when they went looking for a name to write on it, they wrote his. He had been framed, the evidence assembled so neatly that fighting it only made him look guiltier. And when it was over, the career was gone, the name was worthless, and a man who had never stolen a thing in his life could not get hired to sweep a floor. He traded a bright laboratory for a cold one-bay garage where the space heater caught only on the third try, and told no one why. And then, 3 winters ago, the last good thing went too. Francis, the one person who had believed him when the whole world turned away, fell ill. Slowly and then all at once. And he buried her on a gray morning with their boy's hand in his. Her photograph still hung over his workbench, curling at one corner, in a garage she never lived to see. What kept him from going under was 12 years old. His son Danny had been 9 at the funeral, and every year since had watched his father carry the weight of a name the world had branded a cheat. Some mornings it was only the boy, bent over his homework at the workbench under the same failing bulb, asking how a man learns to read an engine, that got Ellis to unlock the doors at all. He had made himself one promise and held to it without fail. His son would not grow up as the son of a liar. He would clear the name, not for himself, for the kid. That was the promise. This was the arithmetic. The eviction letter taped to the garage door gave him 2 weeks. 2 weeks to clear the overdue rent before the landlord took the last thing he owned. He had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Some evenings he stood there with it in his hand, running the same hopeless sum, turning over the one question that truly frightened him. If the garage went, where did that leave the 2 of them? A man and his boy. And what kind of life was there left to give a son, when a father had already lost everything but him? Ellis had one rule that had never made him a dime. If a car could carry someone home safely, he fixed it first, often for free, and worried about the money later. That rule had just steered him, on a rain-black county road, straight into something far larger than a broken alternator, and it would be days before he understood how far it reached. After the line went dead, Ellis did not sleep. He carried the severed wire from the old woman's car to the workbench, and for the first time in years, opened the battered engineering notebook he had once kept for a living. Under the weak light, he sketched the fault exactly as he had found it. The clean cut, the wrong fuse, the loosened connector, the shape of a thing built to fail at speed. He did not yet know why anyone would want an old woman dead on a dark road. He only knew someone with real skill had built it that way, and that he was now the one man alive who could prove it was no accident. And beneath the dread sat something he did not want to name. A familiarity. The care of it. The way the sabotage was built to pass for an accident to everyone but a man who knew where to look, was the same cold craftsmanship that had ruined him years ago. A lie engineered to sit perfectly still and pass for the truth. Whoever had reached under this old woman's car worked the way the people who framed him once worked. Across the city, the woman who had called him was not sleeping either. Her name was Meredith Rhodes, and she ran Rhodes Motors, a name that rolled through every garage in Detroit, his included. The elderly woman on the county road had been her mother, Vivian, a woman who still insisted on driving herself and had spent years waving off her daughter's security people. Those same people had already shrugged the breakdown away. An old car, an old woman, a bad night. Now a mechanic she had never met was telling her it was a lie, and every cold instinct that had carried her to the top of that company was telling her he was right. She had spent her life trusting no one and needing no one. It had made her the most feared name in the building, and tonight, a woman with no one to take this to. Because the thought that kept her awake was simple and terrible. A person who could reach under her mother's hood could reach almost anyone in her world. By morning, one thing had settled in her like a stone. Whatever it cost her to admit it, she was going to need the mechanic, the one man in all of this who owed her company nothing. The car that came the next morning did not belong on a street like his, long and black, parked across the garage's mouth as if it owned the pavement. Two people got out. A lawyer, young and sharp, holding a leather folder like a shield, and a second man who gave no name and did not seem to need one. The still, unhurried kind a company sends when it wants a problem to go quietly away. The quiet man set a slim metal briefcase on the workbench and thumbed it open, and the weak light caught neat, banded stacks of cash. The lawyer slid a single printed page down beside it. Ellis read it slowly. An agreement, a few tidy paragraphs, a line for his signature, and the case beside it was the number made real: $100,000. In exchange, he would state in writing that the fault he had found in the old woman's car was ordinary wear, an accident of age, and never speak of it again to anyone. To a man 2 weeks from losing everything, $100,000 was not a number. It was the debt wiped clean, the lights staying on, the garage door never chained shut, and his boy fed and safe for a long time to come. He read it once and set it back down, unsigned. "You're asking me to sign that a cut wire cut itself," he said quietly. "If somebody really tried to run an old woman off the road, then a piece of paper calling it an accident is the last thing on earth worth $100,000. The lawyer's mouth curved into a small, practiced smile, as if the man across the bench did not yet grasp his own luck. She did not raise her voice. "A man 2 weeks from the street," she reminded him, "a man with a boy at home to feed, did not get handed $100,000 twice in one life. All it asked of him was a single word: accident, and the garage stayed open, the lights stayed on, and his son ate." Ellis looked at the money a long moment. He did not reach for the pen. The quiet man lifted a single finger and she stopped. He studied Ellis a long moment, the way a man looks at a lock he knows he will be coming back for. Then he folded the page away, closed the briefcase, and lifted it off the bench. Ellis had 3 days, he said, the only words he spoke the whole time, to think it over. They would be back for his answer. And the two of them carried the $100,000 out to the long black car and were gone. The quiet they left behind told Ellis more than the deadline had. Nobody spends that kind of money or sends that kind of man over a stranded sedan on a county road. And there was a colder fact beneath it. He had told exactly one person in the world what he found under that hood, and by morning, men with a briefcase knew. Whoever they answered to could hear straight through the walls of Rhodes Motors. Stay with it from here, because the moment Ellis turned that money away, he stopped being a witness and became a problem someone would have to solve. Meredith came to the garage herself the next evening. No lawyers, no long black car, just her, still in the suit but with the armor gone out of it. So she told him the thing she had been afraid to say out loud to anyone. Her company was weeks from launching its first self-driving line, the Vanguard, and for months the test cars had been failing in ways her own engineers could only call unexplained. She had blamed bad code, bad luck. Now she was not sure the failures were failures at all, and she no longer knew which of the people around her she could trust. Ellis heard her out, then told her his own half of it. That morning, 2 strangers had set a briefcase on his bench, $100,000 to sign that the cut in her mother's car was an accident, and never speak of it again. He had not touched a dollar. And there was something else, he said, something he had told no one in years. Whoever rigged that car worked with the same cold, careful hand as the men who had once framed him and taken his name. He had known it the moment his flashlight found the wire. The same fingerprint, the same lie built to sit still and pass for the truth. She believed him. Not because of his face or his voice, because of the briefcase. Men do not pay $100,000 to bury a lie. So he would help her, but not for her $100,000, and not for nothing. He would help her find whoever was doing this, on one condition. When they found them, she would use everything she had to help him finally drag into the light the man who had destroyed his life. The executive who trusted no one looked a long moment at the mechanic the world had thrown away, then put out her hand, a line crossed, the two of them agreeing to go looking for the truth side by side. The next day she brought him on to the technical campus and introduced him to no one by his trade, only as the man who had looked at her mother's car. Then she put the Vanguard failure logs on a screen and let him read them. He didn't need long. A self-driving car is really just a car that reads the road for itself, a computer deciding moment by moment whether to trust what its cameras and sensors tell it. In every failed test, that trust had broken the same way, a fraction of a second too late, and the record of it had been wiped almost before the car stopped. Clean, careful, familiar. It was the same handwriting he had felt under Vivian Rhodes's hood in the rain. Not a resemblance, the same hand. "I'm curious," said a voice behind them, smooth as a closing door. "Why a man who changes oil for a living is reading confidential engineering data?" Trent Ashford was the chairman of the board, a man who had gone his whole life without once being told no. He smiled while he said it, which made it worse. Meredith started to explain, but Ashford was already gesturing toward the exit. The courtesy was over. Ellis turned to go, and that was when he saw it. On a monitor along the far wall, scrolling quietly past, a sequence of error codes most people would never look at twice. He had looked at them 10,000 times. They were the exact codes from the project that had ended his career and taken his name. The project at Halcyon Diagnostics. He stopped where he stood. He knew this work. He had been blamed for it. Those codes had no business existing outside Halcyon's walls. Someone had carried them here. Outside the gate, he asked Meredith one question. Had anyone in her company come out of Halcyon Diagnostics? She did not have to check. Her general counsel, the company's top lawyer, Barrett Keller, had been a senior partner there years ago. Ellis knew that name the way a man knows an old scar. Keller was the partner who had run Halcyon's internal investigation, the man whose signature had decided, on paper, that Ellis was the thief. For years, Ellis had believed him merely wrong. Now, standing in a second company with Halcyon's codes on its screens, he understood. The man had not been wrong. He had been the builder, and his signature was on this company's paperwork too. Meredith did the thing her lawyers had told her never to do. Quietly, without asking anyone, she had the old Halcyon investigation dug out. The background file every careful employer had read before turning Ellis Vaughn away. She read it twice. The dates didn't line up. The findings arrived too neatly, as if someone had known the ending before the story began. She brought it to the garage that evening, and Ellis told her the whole of it at last, the part he had only sketched the night they made their bargain, and had stopped saying out loud years ago because it had never once helped him. At Halcyon, he had found something he was never meant to find. Hidden inside the diagnostic software, the program that decided whether a car passed or failed its safety checks, was a quiet back door that left no fingerprints. It let someone reach into a finished report after the fact and change what the machine had said. A car that failed could be made to pass, and no one reading the report would ever know the number had been touched. He gathered what he needed to report it. He never got the chance. Overnight, the evidence simply wasn't there anymore. The files gone as though they had never existed. And in their place, on an access log he had never signed, sat his own name, tying him to the very theft he had come to expose. By then, he was already the guilty man in every version of the story that counted. Meredith was quiet for a long moment. "The night I first called you," she said, I thanked you with one breath and decided what you wanted from my mother with the next. I read your clothes in your garage before I ever read your work. She looked at the file, then closed it. I was wrong about you. I'm sorry. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and whether you have ever been the one everyone believed was guilty, because it was easier than believing you were telling the truth. Stay with him. He is about to make them look. They had given him 3 days to think it over. They did not wait for 2. By the second morning, a business reporter's story ran under a headline that had nothing to do with a cut wire. It called Ellis Vaughn a disgraced engineer, a man erased once for good reason, now surfacing to prey on the fears of a frightened executive and her elderly mother. Every true thing in it had been bent just far enough to become a lie. The chairman, Trent Ashford, and the company's general counsel, Barrett Keller, had handed the reporter the version they wanted printed, and now it was everywhere. 2 reporters stood in the gravel outside the garage, phones raised, calling through the open bay door. Had he targeted the Rhodes family? How long had he planned it? Ellis said nothing. He had long known that a quiet man in Greece looks exactly like the guilty man a headline needs. Then the landlord came. The eviction letter had promised 2 weeks. Now he wanted the garage cleared by the weekend. A tenant with reporters at his door was no longer worth the risk. What broke the siege was his son. Danny, 12, sat on an upturned crate with the story open on his cracked phone. He read it twice, then looked up and asked the only question that mattered. "Dad, is it true?" Ellis crouched until they were eye to eye. He thought of the boy at 9, at the funeral, and every year since, of being the son of a man the world had called a cheat. He would not let Danny grow into that a second time. "No," he said, "and I'm going to show you it isn't." Saying it out loud steadied him more than any lawyer could have. He called the name he had not dialed in years. Rowan Bishop. An old friend from his engineering days. Now one of the few independent vehicle safety auditors whose word still carried weight. Rowan hesitated. A report like this could end a 20-year career. Until Ellis said the thing that changed everything. Whatever was breaking those test cars had never been found, and in a few weeks the same machines would be carrying families down public roads. Then there was no more hesitating. Meredith offered him a wall of company lawyers. Ellis turned it down. "They'll bury the truth in paperwork," he said. "I don't need lawyers. I need the original server data, the copy nobody has touched." And one day, she had it delivered by nightfall. He worked in his own garage, the one room no one else controlled, with an aging laptop and a shelf of circuit boards salvaged from scrapped cars. Meredith came back near midnight, alone, no security, no assistant, and watched him work. A poor man in a cold room, every movement exact, nothing wasted. He built a simulation. In plain terms, he took the untouched server data, the original test records nobody had thought to scrub, and made a clean copy of the self-driving system run every failure again, forcing it to rebuild the very logs someone had wiped after each crash. What surfaced was worse than a flaw. Buried in the code was a trigger, a single instruction, sleeping, set to wake on one exact date, the public launch of the Vanguard line. On that morning, a car would decide, at speed, to stop trusting its own sensors. The stock would crater. Meredith would be forced out. And the men who had waited for precisely that would take the company. Not a defect, a schedule. And with that, the cut wire under Vivian's sedan finally made sense. The founder shares her late husband, Desmond Rhodes, the man who had built this company, left her where the one vote a takeover could not buy. Remove the old woman on a dark road, dress it as an accident of age, and the last obstacle between these men and the company was gone. The space heater gave out at 3 in the morning and would not catch again. Meredith pulled a spare mechanic's jacket off a hook and wrapped herself in it without a word. Sleeves too long, oil worn into the cuffs. Somewhere in that cold hour, the last of her suspicion went out with the heater. When she asked how he stayed so steady, he said only, without looking up, that panic had never once fixed a broken system. Steady hands and stubbornness did. Then her phone rang. Ashford. Ellis heard only her side, the flat voice telling her to walk away tonight or the board would vote her out by morning. She lowered the phone, shaken. "He can take my chair," she said. "He can," Ellis agreed quietly. "But keep it and let that car reach the road anyway. And you will be the one who signed off on the next family left standing in the rain." She was quiet a long time. By sunrise, the recovered logs finished rebuilding, and the last piece fell into place. The credential that had planted the trigger traced back to the general counsel's office, Barrett Keller's, and it carried an approval signed above him by the chairman. The emergency session was called for 8 in the morning, and the outcome had been arranged before the coffee was poured. Trent Ashford, the chairman of the Rhodes Motors Board, had convened the directors to remove Meredith Rhodes from the company her family had built, and had summoned Ellis Vaughn as well. Not as a witness anyone meant to believe, as a prop to be walked in, looked at, and walked back out. The room was glass and quiet money, and every man at the table had already made up his mind. Ellis came through the door carrying a battered steel toolbox and a worn notebook under his arm. Not a laptop. Someone near the far end laughed low, and smirks moved around the table. "We are discussing technology worth better than $1 billion, Ashford said, without bothering to stand. "I'm told you change oil for a living. Do try to keep up." Ellis didn't flinch. He asked for one thing: that the prototype failure logs be put up on the glass. Then he opened the battered toolbox and laid his own exhibit on the table. The pages of a worn engineering notebook, and beside them the severed wire and the mismatched fuse from Vivian's car. The logs rose onto the wall. To the men in the room, only noise. Ellis let the silence hold, then set one blunt finger on the thread that ran through all of it. The same engineered failure, built to strike without warning and pass for wear. And after every single one, the same clean wiping of the record. "Whoever cut the wire under this woman's car didn't invent a thing," he said. "He reused a tool for making faults happen on purpose. One built to stay inside a testing lab and never leave it. It's buried in the Vanguard software. It left the lab. Same hand both times." Barrett Keller, the company's general counsel, came half out of his chair. "This is speculation from a man with a grudge." The door opened. Vivian Rhodes crossed the room slowly, the founder's widow, carrying the founder's votes, and took the empty chair beside her daughter, asking no one's leave. Meredith moved to suspend the chairman pending a criminal investigation. And the board, that had already decided, began, quietly, to come apart. Because Desmond had never once trusted Ashford, and the founder's shares his widow now voted tipped the count the other way. Then, on the record, Rowan Bishop, Ellis's old friend, seated as the independent safety auditor, confirmed the plain fact of it. The data had lived on the company's own internal servers before Ellis Vaughn ever set foot on the campus. It could not have been carried in or forged by the man they wanted to blame. Meredith brought up the last of it herself, the access logs, signed with Keller's own credential, and above them the approval that had let it all happen, a trail that ran back to the chairman's office. The room did not erupt. It simply went very still. The way a room goes when the powerful people in it understand, all at once and too late, which way the ground has tilted. Ellis watched it with no expression at all. He had waited years to see a room like this one turn, and had stopped believing it ever would. Now that it had, he felt none of the triumph he had once pictured, only a great tiredness, and beneath it, something steadier that took him a moment to name. It was his own name, handed back to him. Ashford lost his seat within the hour, and an investigation carrying his name opened before noon. Keller was suspended before the room had finished emptying, and with his credential in evidence, the old Halcyon file was pulled open with it. The forged access log finally read by people willing to see it. There was no shouting from Ellis, no speech. He closed the notebook and set it back in the toolbox. The trial built to end a career had turned itself around in a single morning, and the name they had erased twice was finally his own again. Meredith found him afterward and offered him a job, a salaried post inside the company, enough to wipe out every debt his ruined name had cost him. Ellis stood with the toolbox in his hand and did not answer right away. He had spent years being ground down by the exact world she was inviting him back into. "I'm not asking you to beg for a place," Meredith said, quieter than the boardroom had ever heard her. "This time the company needs you. That is a different thing." He was still turning it over a week later when Vivian arrived at the garage with something wrapped in a moving blanket. She hung it above the bay door before he could argue, a freshly painted sign, the letters still wet. Vaughn Independent Motors. And beneath it, in smaller script, Certified Safety Partner of Rhodes Motors. So he kept the garage. He kept his own name over his own door, and his independence with it. And he took the company's work without becoming the company's man. A framed letter went up on the wall inside. The finding of the reopened Halcyon case, in plain language, clearing him of the theft they had written onto his name. Signed. Official. The lie undone on paper. The people who had once driven past him in the rain now sent their cars across the city to his door. The expensive ones with worried owners. And he still rolled under a rusted sedan for a man who could pay a little now, and the rest whenever the month allowed, the way he always had. He never celebrated any of it. His only concern had been pulling every tampered car off the road before anyone got hurt. He knew, too well, what a manufactured lie could cost. The old space heater finally quit for good that winter. No third catch, no reluctant orange glow, only cold. Ellis kept the broken one propped in the corner of the garage anyway, the way a man keeps a worn-out thing that had stood there on the night everything turned. His son noticed the change before anyone put words to it. One evening, Danny looked up from his homework at the workbench and said his father seemed to stand a little straighter these days, though he couldn't say why. Ellis told him only this, that doing the right thing can take everything you have for a long, cold while. And then, if you are patient and a little stubborn about it, it hands some of that back to you, with interest. Danny didn't follow all of it that night, but he tucked it away the way children keep the things a parent says quietly and means completely. It was not a large life, but it was his, honestly and under his own name, with his son a few feet away. And there had been a long stretch of cold years when he would not have let himself believe he would get even that much back. On the wall above them hung the framed letter, with his father's name cleared in plain print at the bottom. And beside it lay an old engineering notebook, closed now. The one that had once held the only proof a powerful room never wanted found. If you have ever had your name taken by people who found it easier to blame you than believe you, share this with someone who is still waiting to be believed. And tell us, what did you have to lose before the truth finally caught up?